We have spent the past 3 weeks considering the actions that God requires of us. We have looked to the words of the prophet Micah as our guide, as he wrote, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God?" We have thought through these requirements through the words and actions of Jesus found in the Gospel of Luke. The first week we considered that God requires us to stop and listen, both to Jesus' words and to each other. The second week we remembered that God requires us to be persistent in prayer. Last week we heard the parable of the Good Samaritan, and we recognized the immense detestation between the Samaritans and the Jewish people. Yet they put aside their differences in order to show mercy and love in a time of trial. Through this story, we realize that God requires us to love unconditionally, showing grace and hospitality not only to our immediate neighbor, but even to the people we despise. Today we conclude this series with the parable of a rich man. The passage begins with the context, and a crowd has once again surrounded Jesus to ask questions and to hear his teachings. Someone calls out to him and says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." Now, this seems like a reasonable request to our modern ears. We like things to be equal. We want people to receive what they are supposed to get. And so let's think for a moment about inheritance laws. Today, people usually go to a lawyer, write and sign their will, and designate who will receive what portion of their belongings. In antiquity, however, the inheritance laws were rigid. It would be very unusual for them to be altered. Scholar Alan Culpepper explains the laws in his commentary on the text. He says that the laws stipulated that the elder brother would receive a double portion of the inheritance. If the father had no sons, then his possessions were to be divided among his daughters, but the daughters were then required to marry within their father's tribe, so the possessions would not leave the tribe. This person from the crowd is upset with how his father's finances have been handled. We don't know the specifics, but he hasn't received what he believes he should receive, and he wants Jesus' help. Jesus refuses. He wants no part in this conversation. He asks, "Who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" But Jesus doesn't stop there. He doesn't simply ask the man to leave it to the professionals, to ask someone whose job it was to work through the inheritance laws. Jesus takes it a step further and says, "Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Whoa. We went from a man wanting his fair share to assuming that he was living a life of greed. Perhaps there was more going on than we are privy to. But Jesus takes this opportunity to teach the crowd. Jesus continues with a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. There was surplus. He had goods above and beyond what he had anticipated. And so he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." this language is interesting. It's very self-centered. He doesn't seem to recognize that there are others around him. He had people helping him work the fields. He likely had a family, but his language is very solitary. He continues thinking, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. Once again, his language indicates a solitary action, when in all likelihood he would not be tearing his barn down with his own 2 hands. He would have help, at least. The man continues this thought process. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. He is basking in this wealth. He is relying on it. He is thinking of the life he can live because of this abundance. But Jesus' parables always have a twist, don't they? They always have something surprising, something shocking, something we don't expect. This man seems to have everything going his way, but then God says to him, you fool, this night your life is being demanded of you. The abundance which this man anticipated enjoying for years to come will be of no use to him. He is dying, and as the saying goes, you can't take it with you when you die. What are we supposed to learn from Jesus' conversation with the man and the crowd and the parable he told during that discussion? Let's think about a few aspects of this text. First, the rich man never expressed his gratitude for what he had. He didn't seem to appreciate the people who had worked his land. He didn't give thanks to God for what he had received. His attitude was very self-centered. Second, Jesus never said that wealth is bad. Jesus doesn't tell the man from the crowd that money is evil. He doesn't say that it was unfortunate that the man produced an abundance. It's not problematic even that the man was saving, that he had barns in which to keep what he needed. Jesus never said that wealth is bad, and he never said that we shouldn't have bank accounts or barns. In both instances, it was the attitude of the person that was problematic. The man from the crowd was warned against being greedy. The man in the parable was self-centered as he hoarded his surplus of crops for himself. He never thought of anyone else. Even when the Old Testament tells us again and again to take care of the less fortunate, to take care of our neighbors, to take care of other people, the man never thought of anyone but himself. This made me wonder, how could these situations have been handled differently? What would it look like if the men were not greedy, were not self-centered? I thought about the man in the crowd. I imagined the strain on the relationship between the man and his brother over the inheritance. I wondered how much the inheritance was and whether or not the amount received was truly unfair. I wish I could ask that man, was it worth damaging your relationship with your brother in your dispute over the inheritance? I thought about the man in the parable. I thought about the great abundance of crops that his farms produced that season. And then I imagined what else he could have done with that surplus. He thought he would build bigger barns, but what if he decided to share that surplus with the workers of his field? What if he had the opportunity to sell the surplus and give the money to those in need? What if he asked his local synagogue if they could distribute the surplus to the people who were hungry? What if these men had looked beyond themselves when they pondered their financial situations? I wonder if these questions or possibilities even crossed the minds of these men and the people hearing Jesus in the crowd. There's a hymn called "Draw the Circle Wide." It's originally by a man named Gordon Light, but the version that I have heard is arranged by Mark Miller, who set Light's refrain to a different melody. I first heard this hymn last year at the Young Clergywomen's Conference, and I immediately loved the words. It says, "Draw the circle wide. No one stands alone, we'll stand side by side. Draw the circle wide, draw it wider still." As I listened to the hymn this past week, I wondered how this situation and this parable might be different if the men had changed their focus from greed and self-centeredness to drawing the circle wide, to including others in their abundance. We sometimes fall into the habits of the man from the crowd and the man from the parable. We become greedy. We are not thankful for what we have. We choose to focus upon earthly possessions, and we judge people by what they own. We become self-centered. What would it look like in our own lives if we decided to look beyond ourselves, to draw the circle wide, to include others not only by sharing what we have, but by truly seeing them? By moving past the I statements, the me statements, like the man from the parable, to we statements, remembering that we live together in this world, that we rely on each other, and that the decisions we make affect one another. The final part of this passage tells us, "The things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." It's an interesting phrase, rich toward God. A phrase with no definition or explanation in the text. Maybe it is living into the fullness to which God created you. Maybe it is striving towards perfection in love. Perhaps it is something slightly different for each of us. This week, look beyond yourself. Seek ways that you can draw the circle wider to share with the people around you. Be grateful for all that you have, giving thanks to God. Think about how your decisions, financial and otherwise, affect others, and find ways to be rich toward God. The action that God requires of you this week is to look beyond yourself. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Amen.